Good evening and welcome back to Half Past History. I'm so glad you're here. Wherever you are tonight, whatever kind of day you've had, you can set it down now. This is the part of the day that belongs to you. Before we begin, take a moment to get truly comfortable. Dim the lights or turn them off completely. If you like a fan on or a window cracked open for cool air, go ahead and see to it now. Pull the blanket up to where it feels right. Let your head sink into the pillow and let your hands rest wherever they want to rest. There is nothing you need to do for the rest of this video and nothing you need to remember. If you drift off in the first 10 minutes, that's not a failure. That's the whole idea. And if you're new here, feel free to tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I read every one, and there's something quietly wonderful about a room full of sleepy people scattered across every time zone on Earth. Tonight, I want to tell you about a job that no longer exists. You already know the picture that just formed in your mind. A tower on a black rock far out at sea. A storm throwing water 100 feet up the stones. And inside, a solitary man with a gray beard and a wool sweater talking to himself in the lamplight, slowly going strange from the loneliness. The movies love that man. The novels love him even more. The mad lighthouse keeper, driven half out of his mind by isolation and the endless turning of the light. But did lighthouse keepers really go mad? Did they truly spend their days staring at the sea, wrestling with ghosts in their own thoughts? What did they actually do out there, hour after hour, night after night, for years at a time? Here is the quiet truth, and I'll tell you now, because tonight is not a night for suspense. The real lighthouse keeper was not a madman. The real lighthouse keeper was, of all things, a federal employee. He had a printed rulebook issued by the government, and he was expected to know it by heart. He had a checklist. He had inspections and paperwork and a logbook he filled in every single day in careful ink. He trimmed the wicks of his lamp every few hours, and the rules said the tops had to be cut exactly even. Not roughly even, exactly even. His brass was polished, his lens was spotless, his oil was measured, and his apron was clean because a man from the government might land on his rock at any moment and run a white glove along the railing. The true story of the lighthouse keeper is not a story about madness. It is a story about routine. About the same small, careful tasks, done in the same order, at the same hours, thousands of times, until the work itself became a kind of slow ceremony. And that is why it makes such a perfect story for falling asleep. Because tonight, we're not going to chase a storm. We're going to keep the light. Here's where we'll wander tonight, slowly, with no hurry at all. We'll begin at dusk, climbing the tower stairs with the keeper to light the lamp as the sun goes down. We'll sit through the night watch with him in the little room below the lantern while the beam turns above us. We'll wake with him at dawn to put the light to bed and spend a morning polishing a lens taller than a man. We'll leaf through the little rule book that governed his whole world and find out what the government actually paid for a life like this. We'll meet the lamp itself and the beautiful French invention that turned a small flame into a beam you could see from 20 miles at sea. We'll listen to the foghorns and the great fog bells, the voices the coast used when the light went blind. We'll spend a while in deep winter scraping frost from the lantern glass with the warmest room on the station glowing at the top of an icy tower. We'll meet the families, the wives and children who kept the stations running, and the little traveling libraries that came by boat. We'll visit the loneliest stations of all, the ones built on bare rock miles from shore, the lighthouses that floated, and the supply ships that were their only thread to the world. We'll ride out one great storm from a safe distance and remember two young men who kept their light burning to the very end. We'll meet a small woman named Ida Lewis, who became the most famous lighthouse keeper in America without ever leaving her rock. And at the end, gently, we'll watch the lights learn to keep themselves and say goodnight to the very last keeper of all. If that sounds like a good night's journey, and if these quiet histories help you rest, a like or a subscribe helps this little channel more than you know. But that can wait. Everything can wait. That's the other secret of the lighthouse. Almost nothing out there ever needed to be done quickly. It only needed to be done well and at the proper hour. So let your eyes close if they want to. The sun is going down over the water. The keeper is reaching for his matches, and the light is about to come on. Let's talk about the evening, because the keeper's day truly began when everyone else's was ending. Imagine you are the keeper. It is perhaps half an hour before sunset on a mild evening somewhere on the American coast, sometime in the 1870s. You might imagine the lighting of a great lamp would be dramatic. A flourish, a roar of flame, a burst of light sweeping the sea. The reality was closer to lighting a very well-behaved kitchen lantern at the top of a great many stairs. You leave the house a little early because the rules say the light must be burning from sunset to sunrise, and sunset does not wait for anyone. The tower door closes behind you with a soft boom, and then there is only the stairway. A spiral of iron or stone turning and turning inside the whitewashed wall. 60 steps at some lights. 200 or more at the tall ones. You climb without hurrying. Keepers learn very quickly that a man who runs up a lighthouse arrives in no condition to do careful work with fire and glass. So you climb the way you might rock a child, steadily, patiently, one turn after another, your hand sliding along the cool rail. At the top, you come up through the floor into the lantern room, the small glass crown of the tower. It is the brightest room you know by day and the warmest by night, and it smells of oil and brass polish and the sea. In the center stands the lens, and we'll spend real time with the lens later tonight because it deserves it. For now, know only that it surrounds the lamp like a great glass beehive, taller than you are, and that it is already spotless because you made it spotless this morning. The evening work is a quiet list, and your hands know it better than your mind does. You check the oil reservoir and find it full because you filled it. You check the wick, trimmed level and clean because you trimmed it. You take away the linen cover that protected the lens through the day and fold it carefully. And then, with no ceremony at all, you strike a light and touch it to the wick. A small flame catches, wavers, and steadies. You adjust it with the patience of a man who has done this 1,000 times, raising it slowly, watching the color, because a flame turned too high too fast will smoke, and soot on the glass is an hour of tomorrow's work. And here is the lovely part. That little flame, no bigger than the one on a dinner table, enters the glass rings of the lens, and the lens gathers it, bends it, and lays it flat across the sea in a single white bar of light. Out there in the dusk, a schooner captain 20 miles away sees a star come up out of the water, right where a star should be. If yours is a turning light, you now wind the clockwork, a weight on a long cable like the works of a grandfather clock grown to the size of a tower. You crank the handle, the weight rises, and when you release the mechanism, the great lens begins to revolve around its flame, slow and level, like a carousel for no one. And then the rules ask something of you that I find rather beautiful. You do not simply leave. You are expected to stay with the new flame for a full half hour, watching it the way you might sit with someone until they are truly asleep. Only when the light is burning steady and bright do you go back down the spiral stairs into the blue evening to your supper. Behind you, above you, the beam turns. It will turn all night. Making sure of that is the entire reason you exist. Now let's talk about the night itself, the long hours the myth got so wrong. You might imagine the keeper pacing the gallery in the wind, wild-eyed, talking to the storm. The reality is a chair. A plain wooden chair in the watchroom, one floor below the lantern, beside a small stove, with a kettle that is never quite cold. At a station with an assistant keeper, the night was divided into watches, and half of it belonged to you. At a small station where you kept the light alone, the rules were gentler than you might think. The regulations of 1881 said that a lone keeper must visit his light at least twice between 8 in the evening and sunrise. In practice, most keepers went up far more often, every 2 or 3 hours, because the light was there standing in the world, and no keeper wanted to be the one whose light was seen dark from a passing deck. So the night became a rhythm. You doze in the chair, half listening. The clock on the wall ticks. The sea breathes against the rocks below, in and out, never quite the same twice. At midnight, or near it, you rise, stretch, and climb the stairs again, a lantern in your hand, your shadow turning around you on the curved wall. In the lantern room, the flame is burning just as you left it. You trim the wick if it needs trimming, because a wick slowly chars as it burns, and the rules ask for the flame to be kept at its best every 3 hours or so. You top up the oil if it wants oil. You wean the clockwork again, and the weight rises smoothly in its channel, and the lens keeps turning without ever having stopped. Then you stand for a moment, because every keeper stood for a moment, and you look out. The beam swings away over the water, touches the black horizon, and comes around again. Below, the waves flash white for an instant as the light passes over them, and then go dark, and then flash again. Ship lights, here and there, far off. A red point, a green point, moving slowly. Each one is a crew, and every one of them knows exactly where you are. That was the strange comfort of the work. The keeper was one of the most solitary workers in America, and one of the most watched. Half the sailors on that dark water could point to his flame by name. Then back down the stairs, back to the chair, back to the kettle. Some keepers read through the small hours. Some carved or mended nets, or wrote long letters that the tender would carry to shore weeks later. Some just sat, hands folded, listening to the tower hum in the wind, and by every account that has come down to us, most of them were not lonely in those hours so much as quiet. There is a difference, and the keepers knew it better than anyone. Some nights brought company of a strange, soft kind. On thick nights in the migration seasons, birds crossing the dark would be drawn to the beam, the way moths come to a lamp, dazzle travelers circling the brightest thing in their sky. Now and then one would strike the lantern glass hard enough that the service issued every station spare panes just in case. Keepers wrote about it in their logs with a kind of puzzled tenderness, counting the visitors, noting the species like reluctant naturalists. Some tell of climbing to the gallery at dawn after a thick night and finding exhausted songbirds resting on the rail by the dozen, riding the tower like a ship, waiting for daylight to show them the shore. The keeper would step carefully around them, finish his checks, and leave them to their rest. Even the wild things, it seems, treated the light as a place to stop and breathe. The night passed in these small returns. Climb, trim, wind, look, descend. Climb, trim, wind, look, descend. If you feel your thoughts beginning to blur and soften right about now, you are keeping the watch exactly the way it was meant to be kept. The light doesn't need you to be sharp. It only needs you to come back every few hours, and you always do. Far out at sea, a helmsman glances east, finds your beam exactly where his chart promised it would be, and settles back at his wheel. He will never meet you. He trusts you completely, and the beam turns, and the kettle murmurs, and the night goes on. Let's talk about the morning, because this is where the myth truly falls apart. The mad hermit of the stories has nothing to do all day. The real keeper's problem was the opposite. At sunrise, you climb the tower one last time on tired legs, and you put the light to bed. You turn the flame down slowly the way it was raised, and the lamp goes out with a small breath of smoke. And for the first time in perhaps 14 hours, the lantern room is governed by the sun instead of by you. But you don't go to bed. Not yet. Because the morning after every night watch at every lighthouse in America was the same, and it was cleaning. You might imagine that a lighthouse got a good scrubbing once a season, the way a barn might. The reality is that a first-order lens was cleaned and polished every single morning. Every morning, without exception, storm or shine, Christmas included. Think about what the lens had been doing all night. An open flame had been burning inside a closed glass room. Oil smoke, soot, the fine film that any flame leaves behind, all of it settling invisibly on hundreds of polished glass surfaces. And the whole value of the lens, the entire reason a captain could see your star from 20 miles out, lived in the clarity of that glass. So the keeper became something very close to a curator. You put on a soft linen apron so your buttons could not scratch the glass, and you went over the lens piece by piece with soft cloths and fine polish. The brass frame wiped and rubbed until it glowed. The glass storm panes of the lantern room cleaned inside and outside meant stepping onto the high gallery with your cloth while the gulls turned below you. The lamp itself taken apart, the burner cleaned, the wick trimmed square and true, the reservoir filled with tomorrow night's oil, everything reassembled and left ready because a light that could not be lit at a moment's notice was a broken promise. Then the cover went over the lens to shield it from the sun, and the curtains were drawn around the lantern room glass. And here is a detail I love, and I promise you it is true. The curtains were not for shade. A great lens is a great magnifying glass, and left bare to the summer sun it could gather the daylight and burn things, scorch paint, crack fittings, even start fires. So every morning the keeper of the light spent his last hour of work protecting the world from his own lens. The most powerful light on the coast spent every day sleeping under a linen sheet, like furniture in a closed room. And then at last, breakfast, and a few hours of sleep for the keeper too, while the tower stood quiet and the sea glittered, and the lens dreamed under its cover. The light slept by day, and the keeper slept in pieces, and between them they made one whole vigilance that never closed its eyes. Now let's talk about the afternoons, the hours the stories always skip, because nothing dramatic ever happened in them, which, of course, is why they were the best hours. The afternoon belonged to the station, and the station always wanted something. There was paint, first of all. There was always paint. Salt air eats iron and wood and whitewash without ever resting, so the keeper painted the way other men farm, in seasons, in rotation, endlessly. The tower, the house, the oil shed, the boathouse, the railings, the window frames. By the time you finished the last of it, the first of it was ready again. And the whitewash was not vanity. A lighthouse works by day as well as by night. The bright tower against the land was itself a signal, a day mark, and the rules expected it kept as crisp as the flame. There was the walk to the oil house, that small brick or stone building standing apart from everything else, and it stood apart for a reason. When kerosene replaced the gentler oils, the service decided that hundreds of gallons of it did not belong at the bottom of the tower under the keeper's own bedroom. So the fuel got its own little fireproof house with its cans racked in rows, and the keeper's evening began with a walk across the yard, filling his brass carrying can, oil measured out and written down, then the walk back and the climb. One more small ceremony in a life made of them. There was the logbook, filled in each day in careful script. The weather at morning, noon, and night. The wind, the sea, the work done, the oil used, measured and written down to the fraction of a gallon, because the oil was government property and the government counted. And the ships. Every vessel that passed within sight, noted with her rig and her heading and the hour. Page after page, year after year, in 1,000 logbooks along every coast, keepers were quietly writing down the entire maritime life of America, one sail at a time. More than once, when a ship went missing, the last trace of her anywhere on earth was a single tidy line in some keeper's log. Past the light at 4 in the afternoon, standing south, all well. There was the garden, at stations blessed with soil. Potatoes, cabbages, beans in rows behind a windbreak fence, hens if the island allowed it, sometimes a cow with the calmest life in America. There was fishing off the rocks in the late light, half for supper and half for the stillness of it. There were small repairs that were never quite finished, a hinge, a shingle, a stair tread, the boat. And through all of it, underneath all of it, there was the one rule that shaped every hour. Be ready by sunset. Whatever the afternoon held, it ended the same way every day of the keeper's life. Tools away, hands wash, a look at the western sky, and the climb. You might imagine such a life would feel like a prison sentence. Some keepers surely had their gray days, and we won't pretend otherwise. But listen to what the keepers themselves wrote in those logs and letters, and a different picture emerges. The same 10 tasks, in the same order, under the same sky, with the sea always in your ears. Nothing left undone, and nothing done in a hurry. There is a name for a life like that when a monastery organizes it. The lighthouse keeper simply lived it with a paintbrush in his hand. And when the sun touched the water, the whole day gathered itself to a point, the strike of one small match, and the light came on, and the day's work meant something you could see from 20 miles away. Very few jobs on this earth end every single day with a visible star. His did. Let's talk about the little book that ruled this whole world. Because the keeper answered to something, and it was not the sea. It was a printed rulebook from Washington. For the first half of the 1800s, American lighthouses were run loosely, and it showed. Keepers were hired through political friendships. Oil was bought cheap, lights burned dim, and sea captains complained bitterly that an American light was a rumor, not a promise. So in 1852, the government created a lighthouse board staffed with naval officers and engineers, and the age of the checklist began. The board wrote down for the first time exactly what a keeper was and exactly what a keeper did, and in 1881 those rules were gathered into a small volume called Instructions to Light Keepers. Every keeper in America was handed a copy and was expected to keep it at the station and to consult it whenever he was in doubt. If you ever want to fall asleep in the 1880s, that little book is a door. It tells the keeper that he is responsible for the light and for everything at the station, down to the last brush and funnel. It tells him he may leave his post for divine worship on Sundays to procure needful supplies and on important public occasions, and not much else, and that his absences are to be reported. It tells him the watch must give continuous attention to the light, and that a keeper alone must visit his lamp at least twice between 8 in the evening and sunrise. It tells him how the wicks shall be trimmed, and how the lens shall be cleaned, and in what order and with what cloths. It is the least dramatic document ever written about life on a rock in the ocean, and that was exactly its intention. The board wanted the most reliable light on Earth, and it had discovered the great secret of reliability. Reliability is just routine written down. And there was one more thing in the keeper's life to keep the routine honest. The inspector. Every few months, a government steamer would appear off the station, and a uniformed officer would come ashore, and the station would be examined. The lens, the lamp, the oil records, the paint, the fences, the house itself. Keepers told stories all their lives about inspectors who ran a finger along the top of a door frame or checked whether the kitchen stove was black. A good report meant standing and pride and safety in the position. So the keeper did not polish the brass for the sea or even entirely for the ships. He polished it at least a little for a man with a notebook who might arrive on any calm day, which may be the most reassuringly human fact in this whole story. Even at the edge of the world, on a bare rock in the Atlantic, an American workman kept one eye on the horizon for his supervisor. And in 1884, the service went one step further and dressed its keepers. From the 1st of May that year, keepers and their assistants wore a regulation uniform, a double-breasted coat of navy blue vest and trousers to match, and a navy pattern cap bearing a gold wreath around a little silver lighthouse. Picture that for a moment. A man alone on a rock 30 miles from the nearest town, putting on a brass button coat to climb his own stairs. It sounds absurd until you understand what the uniform was actually for. It said, "This is not a hermit minding a bonfire. This is an officer of a service on duty, whether anyone is watching or not." The keepers, by most accounts, wore it with real pride. Now, what did the government pay for a life like this? Less than you would hope. Through the late 1800s, a keeper's salary generally ran from around $400 to perhaps $1,000 a year, with something near $600 being common, and assistants earning less. A steady wage, a house, oil for the family lamps, and land to garden in an era when steady was worth a great deal. But nobody kept a lighthouse to grow rich. And for most of the century, the job came through politics, a nomination from the local collector of customs, a favor repaid, a letter from a congressman. Only in 1896 did keepers become civil servants, hired and kept on merit, and by then the service had already grown its own quiet culture, families who kept lights the way other families kept farms, fathers training sons, and, as we'll hear soon, more than a few daughters. Now let's finally talk about the lens, because I promised we would, and because the entire profession existed to serve it. Before the lens, a lighthouse was a bonfire with ambitions. For centuries, the best anyone could do was burn something bright and hope. Wood on early towers, then banks of oil lamps backed by polished mirrors. The mirrors helped, but most of the light still sprayed uselessly into the sky and the sea, and on a thick night a captain might not find a major light until he was dangerously close. Then, in the early 1820s, a French physicist named Augustin Fresnel solved the problem, not with a bigger flame, but with better glass. His idea was to surround the flame with rings of precisely shaped prisms, each ring catching light that would otherwise be wasted, bending it and sending it out level with the horizon. Light that would have gone up into the clouds, bent down and made useful. Light that would have fallen into the sea, bent up and made useful. Nothing wasted at all. The result looked like nothing else human beings had ever made, a gleaming beehive of glass and brass, sometimes 12 feet tall, built from hundreds of hand-ground prisms, and at its heart one modest lamp. And nearly every one of them was born in France. For decades, the great lenses came from a handful of Parisian workshops, where the prisms were ground and polished by hand, each one to its own curve, and the finished optic was assembled, tested, taken apart again, and packed into crates of straw for a voyage across the Atlantic. Then, at some cape at the end of America, the crates came ashore through the surf, were hauled up the cliff, carried up the stairs piece by piece, and a whole lighthouse's reason for existing was reassembled in the lantern room like the world's most delicate puzzle, French glass set turning above an American sea. Some of those same lenses are turning still. The great first-order lenses could take that lamp flame and lay it 20 miles across the water. Sailors called the big ones by name and knew them by their signatures, because this was the other beauty of the system. A turning lens with panels of prisms did not shine, it flashed, and the timing of the flashes could be set like a piece of music. One flash every 10 seconds at this cape. A group of 2 flashes at that island. A steady beam at the harbor mouth. A captain in the dark with no instruments but a clock in his eyes could count the rhythm of a light and know exactly which piece of America he was looking at. The coast at night was a line of slow lighthouses, each saying its own name over and over in light. And the keeper was the servant of that sentence. Which brings us to what the flame actually ate, because the government thought about this constantly. In the early years, American lamps burned whale oil, the finest of it pressed from the head matter of sperm whales. When whaling declined and the price climbed, the service tried nearly everything: rapeseed oil and then lard oil rendered from pigs, which lit the American coast for years, and even olive oil in some trials. Then came kerosene, mineral oil, cheap and fierce and bright, and by 1877 the Lighthouse Board had declared its preference for it, though converting every lamp on every coast took years of careful work, because kerosene was also far easier to set wrongly ablaze. Later still, around the turn of the century, came acetylene gas and then the electric bulb, and each new fuel asked a little less of the keeper than the one before. You can hear it coming, can't you? The end of the story hidden inside the fuel can. But that end is still decades away, and the night outside our tower is still deep, so we'll leave the electric age for the last part of our journey. For now, the lamp burns oil, the clockwork is wound by hand, the wicks are trimmed by a man in a linen apron, and 20 miles out the light flashes and pauses and flashes, saying its name, all night, to everyone. Now let's talk about the keeper's true enemy. It wasn't the storm. A storm is honest. You can see a storm coming, and a light shines through wind just fine. The enemy was fog, because fog is the one weather that defeats light itself. On a thick night, the most magnificent lens in America, 12 feet of French glass and a flame kept to perfection, could vanish at half a mile. All that power swallowed whole a few hundred yards from the rocks it was guarding. And so every fog-bound station kept a second signal, and when the gray wall rolled in, the lighthouse changed from a thing you see into a thing you hear. The earliest answer was almost comically direct. A cannon. At Boston Light, all the way back in the 1700s, the keeper answered fog by firing a gun at intervals, a single boom rolling out over the gray water, so that inbound ships could feel their way past by ear. Later came the fog bells, and these are worth lingering on because they were lovely machines. A great bronze bell, sometimes 1,000 pounds or more, hung in its own small tower beside the light. And ringing it was not a man with a rope, not for days on end. It was clockwork. The same idea as turning lens, a heavy weight on a cable, wound up by the keeper's crank, and as the weight slowly descended, it drove a mechanism, and at the set moment a cam tripped a spring and a hammer swung and the bell spoke. Once every 10 seconds, or 15 or 20, each station with its own count, hour after hour, all through the fog. The keeper's job was to keep the weight wound and to listen. Because if the striker jammed, some keeper stood in the bell tower and swung the hammer by hand on the count for as long as it took. There are stories in the service's records of keepers and their wives hand-striking a bell through an entire night, trading places in the dark, keeping the rhythm, because somewhere out there in the gray a schooner was steering by that sound. Then the age of steam arrived, and the fog signal grew into a small factory. The great stations got steam whistles and sirens, the same deep voices as a locomotive or an ocean liner, driven by coal-fired boilers in their own brick signal houses. And now, when the fog came, the keeper became a stoker. Light the fires, watch the water glass, feed the coal, build the steam, and then start the timing gear. So the whistle blew its blasts on the station's own signature, just as the lens flashed the station's own rhythm. A siren in full voice could swallow close to 200 pounds of coal in a single hour, and better than 100 gallons of water, and a long fog meant days of shoveling in shifts, half-deaf, dusted gray with cinders. Keepers wrote that they could bear any storm, but a week of fog wore a man down to the bone. And yet think of what that wall of sound was. Every foghorn on every coast, timed and counted, was a voice saying the same thing the light said. I'm here. You're not lost. This way home. Sailors learned the voices the way they learned the flashes. This station 2 blasts and a rest, that one a single long bellow, and generations of coastal children fell asleep to a distant foghorn the way you're falling asleep to this, a low sound far away repeating meaning safety. If there is a more comforting machine in all of history than a foghorn heard from a warm bed, I have not found it. And then there was winter. Let's spend a few minutes in it, from under our blankets, where winter belongs. The rulebook itself changed with the season. From the 1st of October to the last of March, the regulations at fully manned stations wanted extra hands in the lantern around sunset, through that first critical hour, for one simple reason. Frost. On a cold, clear night, the lantern glass would bloom with it, inside and out, and a frosted pane does to a beam what fog does, only quietly, and a keeper could not simply light his lamp and go down to supper. So they stood in the lantern with cloths and scrapers as the temperature fell, clearing the panes, keeping the little stove drawing, chasing the white bloom from the glass so the light went out clean over a freezing sea. On the worst coast, winter came up the tower from below as well. Freezing spray, flying 100 feet in a gale, could case the whole seaward side of a lighthouse in ice, stairs, railings, gallery, until the tower stood like its own monument in frosted glass, and the keeper chipped his morning path with a hatchet. Even the oil fought back. The lard oil that lit mid-century America turns thick and cloudy in the cold and finally sets solid like the fat at the top of a roasting pan. Winter keepers kept their oil warm at the stove and carried it up the tower quickly, and lamps were fitted with warmers because a lamp that starved at midnight in January was the exact failure the whole service existed to prevent. And on the Great Lakes, winter simply ended the world for a while. When the shipping season closed and the harbors froze, many lake lights were shut down for the winter. The lens wrapped, the house drained, the keeper rowing or walking ashore to winter quarters like a bear going to den, to return with the ice breakup in spring. The light itself hibernated. Even vigilance, it turns out, has seasons. But at the ocean stations, the light burned all winter, and the keepers will tell you through their logbooks that deep winter had its own strange reward. The clearest nights of the year when the beam ran out over black water like a blade. The silence after a snowfall when even the sea seemed muffled. The lantern room, the warmest place on the station, glowing at the top of an iced tower like an ember in a white lamp. And below, in the house, the family close around the stove, the wind working the shutters, the year's last library box open on the table. A winter night, high in a warm tower above a cold sea, with everything done that needed doing, and nothing to do now but watch and doze. If you can think of a better room in all of the 1800s for the sleep you're drifting toward right now, I can't. Stay there a while. The frost is on the outside of the glass. You're on the inside. Let's talk about something the lonely keeper myth leaves out entirely. At most American lighthouses, the keeper was not alone. He was surrounded by his family, and the station was as much a household as an outpost. The Lighthouse Board actually preferred it that way. From its earliest years, the board liked to hire married men, reasoning that a man with his wife and children beside him was steadier, more rooted, less likely to abandon a lonely posting, and that preference held all the way until the Coast Guard took over the lights in 1939. So picture the station again and fill it properly this time. Washing on a line in the sea wind. A dog asleep against the oil shed in the sun. Children who learned their sums at the kitchen table and learned the weather without ever being taught it, the way other children learn the streets of their town. Officially, the government had hired one man. In practice, it had hired everyone in the house. The wife of a keeper could trim a lamp, wind the clockwork, and stand a night watch, not because the rules asked her to, but because life did. When the keeper was sick or ashore for supplies, or hauling a neighbor's boat off a bar, the light still had to burn, and it did, because someone in an apron went up the stairs and lit it. Children grew up hauling oil cans and polishing brass the way farm children haul water and feed hens, and the job ran in families like a trade. Sons followed fathers into the service. Widows were formally appointed to their husbands' lights, and daughters, in a few famous cases we will come to very soon, outshone everyone. Was it isolated? Even so. Of course it was. At the far stations, school was a boat ride away or a mother's kitchen lesson, church was a calendar event, and a doctor was a flag signal and a long wait. The neighbors were seabirds. The rhythm of the family week bent around the light the way other families bent around a farm. Sundays, the rules allowed the keeper to leave for divine worship, and at the nearer stations the whole household would row across to the mainland church in their best clothes, the lighthouse standing behind them with its lens curtained, keeping the Sabbath in its own way. At the far stations, church was a Bible on the kitchen table and a hymn or two against the sound of the sea, and school was wherever the mother declared it to be, sums and spelling between the washing and the watch. Some island children rowed themselves to the mainland schoolhouse every day in their own small boats with the weather eye their parents had given them, and thought nothing of it and grew up to tell their grandchildren about it at great length. But the Lighthouse Service did something about the isolation that I find genuinely touching, and it involved books. Beginning in 1876, the service assembled small portable libraries, sturdy wooden boxes, each packed with a few dozen volumes, novels, histories, magazines, sermons, and sent them out on the supply boats. Each box stayed at a station a few months. Then the boat came back, took your box, and left a different one, a fresh crate of strangers to spend the winter with. There was even a little ledger inside each box where the exchanges were recorded, tiny libraries with tiny card catalogs circulating along the loneliest addresses in America. Families would gather when the new box was pried open, and the books would be lifted out one at a time, examined, argued over, and claimed. On a rock with no town, no shop, and no road, that box was the theater, the school, and the newspaper all at once. The keepers had other medicines for the quiet, too. Fishing off the rocks, half for the table, half for the soul. Model ships built patiently through the winters. Gardens coaxed out of thin island soil. Long letters, journals, sketchbooks, an entire culture of small, absorbing, unhurried things, the same things, in fact, that people rediscover today whenever they want to slow their minds down. The Lighthouse family had no name for any of it. They just called it the evening. Now let's go out to the hard stations, the ones the postcards never showed, because there were lighthouses with no island at all. Some lights stood on bare reefs and wave-swept ledges, towers rising straight out of the ocean with iron landings instead of gardens, and no room for families at all. These were the rock stations, and they were the closest the real service ever came to the lighthouse of the myth. Out there, the crew was usually 3 men, keepers and assistants together, living in a stack of round rooms, bedroom above storeroom, kitchen below watchroom, with the sea on every side of every window. Space was a ship's space. You learned to live at elbow distance from 2 other men, to share a stove, to take your turns and hold your tongue, and the service learned to rotate the men, weeks on the rock and then weeks ashore with their families, who lived in houses provided at a shore station, watching the weather and waiting for the relief boat. And everything came by boat. Which brings us to the quiet heroes of this whole story, the lighthouse tenders. The tenders were the service's little steamers, and they were the thread that held the whole system together. And here is a detail almost too charming to be true, except that it is. The Lighthouse Service named its tenders after flowers and shrubs and trees. The supply ship butting through a winter sea towards some frozen rock station would be called the Hyacinth or the Amaranth or the Lilac or the Holly. Hard little working boats, iron-hulled and coal-fired, smelling of oil barrels and rope, every one of them named like a spring garden. Somewhere in Washington, a clerk with a seed catalog had the gentlest job in the federal government. They carried the oil, the paint, the coal, the flour, the mail, the inspector, the new keeper coming out and the old keeper going home, the library boxes, the medicine, and the news. For an offshore station, the tender was the world, arriving on a schedule the weather constantly rewrote. Landing day was the great day of the calendar. Barrels swung ashore on a derrick or ferried in by small boat through the swell. At one famous cliff-top light on Lake Superior, the keepers used a steam hoist to crane their supplies straight up the rock face from the tender below, groceries arriving like cargo at the top of a mast. Everything counted, everything signed for, everything carried up the stairs. And then the tender's whistle, and her smoke shrinking down the horizon, and the station settling back into its own small orbit, provisioned for another season. And there were places where even a rock tower could not stand, and for those the service did the most stubborn thing imaginable. It anchored a lighthouse that floats. These were the lightships, and they deserve a quiet minute of their own. Where a dangerous shoal lay miles offshore, under deep shifting water, with no rock to build on at all, a small stout ship was anchored directly over the hazard, painted red with the name of her station in great white letters down her side, and a light hoisted at her masthead every night. She never sailed anywhere. That was the whole point of her. Her entire duty was to stay riding her great anchor over the shoal, through every storm the ocean brought, marking the one patch of sea every other ship must avoid by standing on it. The men who crewed the lightships had, by common agreement, the hardest berth in the service. A lighthouse keeper's tower, whatever else it did, held still. The lightship rolled. She rolled in fair weather, and in fog she rolled, while her fog signal thundered above the crew's bunks, and in storm she rolled like a barrel, while every other vessel on the coast ran for harbor, and her anchor chain groaned, and her lamp swung at the masthead, burning. The lightship men stood their watches, tended their light and their horn, fished off the stern, and counted the days to their relief crew, and when they finally retired, they famously complained that a bed that did not move felt wrong. Hold a kind thought for the lightship men tonight. Of everyone in this whole drowsy story, they earned their sleep the hardest. Do you see what the service had actually built without ever quite saying so? A navy of patience. Little ships on slow circuits, feeding little garrisons of families and watchmen, so that a chain of flames could keep burning along 4,000 miles of coast. No conquests, no battles, no headline. Just oil delivered on time for 100 years. We are very close now to the part of the story the myth feeds on, the storms, the wrecks, the rescues, and we will go there next, gently. But hold this picture first, because it is the truer one. A calm evening at a rock station. 3 men who have run out of things to say to each other years ago and are comfortable that way. One of them washing dishes. One of them reading a library book with his boots off. And one of them climbing the stairs with a lantern to trim a wick and wind a clock and look out for a while at the turning of the light. Let's talk about the storms now. You're safe and warm where you are, so we can watch this from a distance, the way the keepers' families watched from shore. Most storms, it should be said, were simply work. The light burned in bad weather exactly as in good, and a gale mostly meant wet stairs, rattling panes, and a keeper checking his lamp a little more often through the noise. The tower would hum and tremble. The spray would rake the glass 100 feet up, and in the morning there would be salt to wash off the lantern and shingles to count. The keeper's logbooks record hundreds of such nights, always in the same steady hand, and the entries are almost comically calm. Heavy gale from the northeast. Light burning brightly. That steadiness was the job, and it held at every station through almost everything. But the sea did, a few times in that century, ask more of the keepers than anyone should be asked. And if we are going to spend a night honoring this profession, we should remember the hardest of those nights. It happened at a place called Minot's Ledge, off the Massachusetts coast, where a reef lies barely underwater a mile from shore, right in the sea road to Boston. Ships had been tearing themselves open on it for a generation. So in the late 1840s, the government tried something bold, a lighthouse standing not on an island but on the reef itself, an open framework of iron legs socketed into the rock, with the keeper's quarters and the lantern perched on top like a birdhouse on stilts. The theory was that storm waves would pass harmlessly through the open legs. The keepers who lived on it were never convinced. The first keeper felt the tower sway and shudder in every blow, said plainly that he thought it unsafe, and resigned after less than a year. His successor voiced the same fears. The tower groaned in weather like a masthead, and the men who tended its light lived with that sound. In April of 1851, a great northeast storm came up the coast, one of the worst New England had seen in years. The head keeper happened to be ashore for supplies, and the light was in the hands of his two young assistants, Joseph Antoine and Joseph Wilson. As the seas built through those days, the two men did their duty, and history should say that plainly and proudly. The lamp was lit. The fog bell rang. Through the night of the 16th of April, watchers on shore could see the light of Minot's ledge still burning out there in the white chaos, and the bell was heard between the gusts. The two keepers kept their light to the very end. Sometime after midnight, the iron legs gave way, and the tower went down into the sea, and both young men were lost. We won't linger on it. The sea took them gently, or it did not, and no one alive knows, and they were mourned, and they are remembered, and that is what we can do. But their story changed things, and this is why it belongs in tonight's telling. The wreck of the first Minot's ledge light taught American engineers a lesson written in the hardest possible ink, and when they came back to that reef, they came back humble. The second Minot's ledge lighthouse took 5 years to build. It was made of granite blocks cut and dovetailed into each other and into the rock itself, so that every course of stone locked into its neighbors, and the whole tower stood, in effect, as a single stone. It was lit in 1860, and keepers climbed its stairs for generations. It is standing right now, tonight, in the dark off the Massachusetts shore, holding its light up over the same reef, still, after more than a century and a half of everything the Atlantic could throw at it. Sailors later gave its flashing signature 1 flash, then 4, then 3, a sweetheart's meaning, and called it the I love you light. Out of that terrible night came one of the most steadfast structures human beings have ever built, and a promise the service kept from then on. The light goes on, but never again at that price. And the keepers went on climbing the stairs in fair weather and foul at Minot's and everywhere else for another 100 years. Before we leave the storms, let me tell you about one more of those nights, because this one ends well, and because the keeper in it was a girl of 16. Her name was Abby Burgess, and her father kept the twin lights on Matinicus Rock, a bare 30-acre island far out in the mouth of Penobscot Bay, off the coast of Maine, about as remote as family lighthouse keeping ever got. In January of 1856, supplies ran low, and her father sailed for the mainland to buy food and oil, leaving the lights in Abby's care, along with her invalid mother and her 3 younger sisters. It was meant to be a short trip. Then the wind came around to the northeast, and rose, and kept rising. The storm that followed was one of the worst in memory on that coast, and behind it the sea stayed so high for so long that no boat could reach the rock. Her father was gone almost a month. For those weeks, everything on Matinicus Rock was Abby. When the seas began to sweep across the low parts of the island, she moved her mother and sisters out of the house and into the light tower, judging correctly that the tower was the one thing the ocean could not take. The waves ran knee-deep over the island. The old dwelling was battered and swept, and through all of it, every evening, a 16-year-old girl climbed the stairs and lit the lamps, tended them through the night, trimmed the wicks, and kept both lights burning at full strength, night after night after night, while rationing out for her family what food remained, by some accounts a cup of cornmeal and an egg a day. Not once did the lights fail, not one night in nearly a month. She wrote about it afterward in a letter to a friend in the plainest possible words, saying that under God she had been able to perform all her accustomed duties as well as her father's. That was all. The service never forgot her, and neither did Maine. Abby Burgess spent most of the rest of her life at lighthouses, married into a keeping family, and raised her own children at a light station. And when she died an old woman, she was still thinking about her lamps. Sailors' daughters are like that. And she brings us at last to the door of the most famous keeper of them all. Now let me introduce you to the most famous lighthouse keeper in American history. She was about 5 feet tall. Her name was Ada Lewis. Ada was born in Newport, Rhode Island in 1842, and when she was a girl, her father was appointed keeper of Lime Rock Light, a small station on a scrap of rock in Newport Harbor, so close to town you could see the church steeples, and so separate that everything, school, church, groceries, arrived and departed by rowboat. Just months after the family moved out to the rock, her father suffered a stroke and could no longer manage the light. And so, quietly, without any appointment or announcement, the work of Lime Rock Light passed to his family and above all to Ida, a teenager. For years she tended the lamp morning and night and rowed her younger brothers and sisters to school across the harbor in all weathers every day. Newport boatmen used to say that Ada Lewis could handle a boat better than any man in Rhode Island, and Newport boatmen did not say such things lightly. And then there were the rescues. They began when she was still in her teens, and they never really stopped. Sailors capsized in squalls. Soldiers from the harbor fort gone through thin ice or swamped in overloaded boats. Boys showing off in borrowed skiffs. Whenever the harbor took someone, the small figure from Lime Rock would already be at her oars. The most famous night came in March of 1869 in a freezing storm, when 2 soldiers from Fort Adams were spotted clinging to their overturned boat in the harbor chop. Ida went out into that water, hauled both drowning men over her stern one after the other, and rowed them home to the lighthouse kitchen and the stove. She was 27 years old, and she had done it in a snow squall, and the story got out. Newspapers across the country fell in love with her. Magazines put her on the cover and called her the bravest woman in America. Songs were written. A parade was held in Newport, and thousands came, and among her admirers were generals and senators, and eventually a president of the United States came to call at Lime Rock. Through all of it, by every account, Ida Lewis remained what she had always been, a quiet, deeply modest woman who found the fuss slightly bewildering and went on trimming her lamp. When asked how she found the strength to pull grown men from the sea, she gave an answer worth falling asleep on. She said the light needed keeping and the people needed saving, and she was there. Officially, for all those years, the keeper of record had been first her father, then briefly her mother. Only in 1879, after more than 2 decades of actually doing the work, was Ada Lewis formally appointed keeper of Lime Rock Light in her own name with a salary of $750 a year, which made her for a time the best paid lighthouse keeper in the United States, and no one in the service begrudged her a dollar of it. She kept her light for the rest of her life, more than half a century on that little rock all told, and she is credited with saving at least 18 lives, and the real number, kept in her own modest silence, was likely higher. And when she died in 1911, the government did something it has never done for anyone else before or since. It renamed the lighthouse for her. Lime Rock Light became Eda Lewis Rock Light, the only lighthouse in America ever renamed in honor of its keeper. And she was never an exception in kind, only in fame. Dozens of women kept lights along the American coasts, wives, widows, and daughters, standing night watches and scrubbing lenses and rowing through weather, decades before the country let them vote. The service, whatever its faults, had learned early what the sea teaches everyone eventually. The light does not care who keeps it. It only cares that it is kept. Before we let the electric age in, we owe the old myth one last honest look. We began tonight with the mad keeper of the movies. So, did lighthouse keepers really lose their minds out there? Here's what the record actually shows. Keepers were human. In a service of thousands of people across 100 years, there were certainly sorrows and gray winters, and a few keepers whose troubles are noted in the files, just as there were in every town and every trade of that century. But historians who have gone through the service's records looking for an epidemic of lighthouse madness have come back empty-handed. There isn't one. The logbooks are, if anything, almost embarrassingly sane, page after page of weather, chores, and visitors in steady handwriting for decades. And you already know why, because you've spent tonight inside the answer. The keeper's life was not empty. It was full of small, scheduled, meaningful work, of family, of animals and gardens and library boxes, and of a purpose visible from 20 miles at sea. Emptiness frays people. Routine, it turns out, mostly holds them together. There's a stranger version of the myth you may have heard, that keepers were poisoned into madness by their own lamps, by the mercury some great lenses floated on. And this one has a grain of physical truth to it, so it's worth a moment. Late in the lighthouse era, some of the largest turning lenses really were floated on baths of liquid mercury, a beautiful piece of engineering that let tons of glass spin at the push of a finger. And mercury vapor really is poisonous, and no modern safety officer would smile at an open basin of it in a sealed glass room. But the timing ruins the legend, at least on this side of the ocean. American lighthouses did not begin using mercury floats until around the time of the First World War, at the very twilight of the keeper era. The bearded keeper of the 1800s, the one the movies love, tended a lens that turned on wheels and rollers wound by a hand crank with not a drop of mercury in the building. Whatever the storytellers say, his mind was his own. So let the myth go gently, the way you'd release something that was never really yours. The truth was always quieter and always kinder. They were not madmen at the edge of the world. They were housekeepers of the horizon, and the horizon was about to stop needing them. Let's talk softly about how it ended. No one decided to end the age of the lighthouse keeper. It ended the way a tide goes out, in small movements, none of them dramatic, all of them one direction. First the fuels, as we heard, each new one asking a little less of the keeper. Kerosene asked for fewer wick trimmings than lard oil. Acetylene gas could be regulated with valves, and some acetylene lights learned a wonderful trick, a sun valve that shut the gas off by day and lit it again at dusk all by itself. You can imagine a keeper watching that device and hearing very faintly the future clearing its throat. Then electricity came up the coast, wire by wire. An electric bulb needs no wick, no oil, no morning disassembly. When a bulb burned out, A machine could rotate a fresh one into place like a revolver loading a new round of light. Timers could switch the lamp at sunset and sunrise more punctually than any man on any stairs. By the 1920s and 30s, the writing was on every lantern room wall. In 1939, the old civilian Lighthouse Service itself was folded into the Coast Guard, and the keepers who stayed on wore a uniform now, and their numbers quietly shrank. And beginning in earnest in the 1960s, the Coast Guard worked down the list of the remaining manned lights station by station year by year. Automation was not a villain. Let's be fair to it in the dark, where fairness comes easier. It never once fell asleep, and it never once had to bury an assistant, and it freed thousands of men and women from a hard, bounded life that fewer and fewer Americans were willing to live. But something did leave the coast when the keepers left, and even the Coast Guard seemed to know it. At station after station, the last day had the same small choreography. A crew arrived by boat or helicopter to install the new equipment. The machinery was tested and it worked. The last keeper signed the logbook that keepers at that station had been signing, some of them since before the Civil War. And then he locked a door that had never in living memory been locked and went down to the boat, and the light behind him kept turning exactly as before for no one. By 1990, it was done. Every lighthouse in the United States ran itself, every one with a single exception, and I'm saving that exception for the very end of tonight because it is the gentlest part of the whole story. The lights are still out there, you know. Fewer and electric and satellite checked, but still burning, still flashing their names to ships that now hardly need them. The way a parent leaves a hall light on long after the children have grown. And the towers still stand in their old paint, kept now by history societies and volunteers and people who simply fell in love with them. Which, if you think about it, means the profession never quite died. It just stopped being paid. And so we've come the whole way around from dusk to dusk. We lit the lamp with the keeper and sat the night watch beside the stove. We polished the great lens in the morning and painted the endless white paint of the afternoon. We read the little rulebook and met the inspector and learned what $600 a year actually bought. We watched a French genius fold light itself into rings of glass. We met the families, the library boxes, the flower-named tenders on their patient circuits, the three quiet men on the rock, and the lightship crews rolling at anchor over the shoals. We stood with the shore crowd in the storm of 1851, and we rode Newport Harbor with the bravest woman in America. And we watched the whole calling fade, not in failure, but in success, a promise so well kept that it finally learned to keep itself. The keepers are gone now. But every single night, without one exception, for as long as the Republic has existed, the lights along the American coast have come on at dusk. Every night in war. Every night in peace. Every night, including this one. Somewhere out there right now, a beam is turning over cold water, and no one is climbing the stairs, and it burns anyway, because 100 years of people in linen aprons taught the world exactly how it should be done. You can sleep on that. The watch is kept. If you're still with me, stay just a little longer. I have two more small stories for you, quiet ones, the kind that belong to the very edge of sleep. I told you every American lighthouse was automated by 1990, with one exception. The exception was the first one, Boston Light, on Little Brewster Island at the mouth of Boston Harbor is the oldest light station in the United States, first lit in 1716, before there was a United States for it to guard. And when the great automation reached its doorstep, Congress itself stepped in. By law, in 1989, Boston Light was to remain staffed forever. One station, kept deliberately human as a living monument to all the others. The lamp itself was eventually automated too in 1998, but the keepers stayed, tending the station, guiding visitors, keeping the old ceremonies. And in 2003, the Coast Guard appointed a new keeper of Boston Light, the 70th keeper in an unbroken line stretching back to 1716. Her name was Sally Snowman. She was a doctor of education, a Coast Guard auxiliarist, a woman who had fallen in love with the island as a little girl on a family boat trip, and she was the first woman ever to keep Boston Light, and, as it turned out, the last keeper of any American lighthouse at all. For 20 years she kept the station, living out on the island for long stretches with the gulls and the foghorn, welcoming boatloads of visitors in summer, writing books about the light, wearing 18th century keeper's dress on ceremonial days, and describing her job always as the best one on earth. She retired at the end of 2023, and the Coast Guard did not appoint a successor. 3 centuries of American lighthouse keeping ended there, not in a storm, not in tragedy, but with a smiling woman in her 70s handing over the keys of a well-kept island, her work complete. Somehow, that feels exactly right. The first American light station was also the last one with a keeper, and the last keeper of all was a volunteer at heart, who did it purely for love. The profession began with a flame on an island in Boston Harbor. It ended softly on the same island with the light still burning. It's burning there tonight. One more small story, and then we'll say goodnight. Here's a gentle secret for some future summer of yours. You can still go. The lighthouses of America are nearly all still standing, and hundreds of them can be visited and climbed, and a surprising number can even be slept in. Up and down the coasts, old light stations have become little museums and inns kept by volunteers, by retired couples, by history societies, by people who simply couldn't bear to watch them fade. At some, you can spend the night in the keeper's own house in a spare iron bed with the beam sweeping past the window all night like a slow, silent metronome. At a few, you can sign on as a volunteer keeper yourself for a week or a season, raising the flag, tending the grounds, greeting the day boats, keeping the logbook, real entries in real ink in a book that will outlive you. There are little lights in river mouths and harbor entrances where the overnight guests are handed the station flag at dusk with real ceremony, and old cast iron towers standing in open water where you arrive by launch, sleep in a round room, and wake to find the tide has changed the whole world around your bed. People who do it always say the same thing afterward. They say the first day felt empty and the third day felt full. The same 10 tasks, in the same order, under the same sky. The old medicine still working. And if you never go at all, that's fine too. Because the truest way to visit a lighthouse was always from a distance, at night, half asleep, the way sailors visited them. A light on the edge of the dark, promising that somebody once cared enough to keep it. You're already there. So let the tower go dark in your mind now, room by room, from the bottom up. The oil room, with its cans in their rows, all full, all sealed. The kitchen, warm from the stove, the kettle finally quiet. The watchroom, the chair empty, the rulebook closed on its shelf. The stairs, unwinding themselves into the dark, one turn after another, 60 steps, 100 steps, no need to count them tonight. And at the very top, the lantern room where the great lens turns under its linen cover in the moonlight, spotless, ready at rest. The keeper's day is done. The wicks are trimmed for tomorrow. The log is written, weather noted, all ships pass safely, nothing to report. And the light is doing what it has always done, turning slowly over the water, saying its name to no one, saying it anyway. Sleep now, the way the keeper slept. Not anxiously, but readily, with everything in its place and the watch handed on. The sea will breathe in and out against the rocks all night, whether anyone listens or not. Let it breathe for you. Thank you for keeping the light with me tonight. Good night, sleep deeply, and I'll see you at the next one.